here it is.
We went to fluorescence on or off?
Who hoped to be here today, and then something or other came up and they can't. And we'll miss them, although it does at the same time give us a little more interactive time when we get to that point of our afternoon. And then I know we're all missing people that we worked with, knew, and loved, who are in West 8th, and that was shared by 3 organizations, and one of those 3 organizations was CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. And I also remember one of the big San Francisco demonstrations a lot of people went to from Eugene, included a large contingent from the Black Student Union who marched in that demonstration with a big banner that said, "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger." So it wasn't ever all white. And of course, the people at the other end of the conflict were not white, just to bear that in mind. I wanted also to say a little bit about where what we're doing today fits into an overall set of things that Calc is trying to do. So we're very fortunate to have Dan willing to run the video camera, and then Spencer Barrett, who comes to us from Lane County Historical Museum as a volunteer. He's going to be shooting 3 hours of tape. We hope ultimately to have a product that's about a half an hour long that can be used in classrooms. So that's going to be quite a piece of work. And one of the reasons Stefan Ostrek is here, and Andy will join him in this, is to note down things that really should be in that final product. So that's one piece. On Sunday, Calc is going to be sponsoring in this church upstairs in the sanctuary a dramatic reading of this.
Go ahead and have a seat, Margaret. Are you going to stay there?
Yeah.
Let's do this.
I'm next.
Yeah, but you're going to move over there when you speak. So every speaker is going to speak from here.
Yeah.
So Margaret, I'm going to not do that. One of these has a longer cord than the other one. Which one is it?
Yeah, you can come over here right now, Don. Are you done, Dan?
No, not quite. Just one more second.
Are you done explaining?
I'm done explaining,
Okay,
yes.
so I can start explaining.
You can start explaining. Yeah.
All right. Well, my name's Margaret Halleck, and it's my great honor to be the moderator of the program today. It's just a wonderful group that Marion and Calc has gathered here. And as she said, the primary goal of this is to preserve the tremendous and wonderful and emotional and painful stories of the peace movement in Eugene during the time of the Vietnam War. So it's not a public event, but we are going to try to have a video account that will be lodged at the U of O collections, perhaps in the Lane County Historical Museum, and then a educational video. So there's so much to say about the peace movement, and all of you will say that. I just want to thank you for coming and telling your stories, and recognize that all of you had a really important role. One reason that we are doing this in each community is that you may know that the Department of Defense is doing its own commemoration of the Vietnam War, and I last year found out about their commemoration, and I'm the director of the Wayne War Center at the University of Oregon, and what they're doing really is not nearly sufficient for to commemorate all of the activities associated with the Vietnam War. So I spent last year organizing some programs on Vietnam and Wayne Morse's peace activism. And Ron and others, Steve, were part of that. So it's my honor to be your moderator. And this is what we're going to do. We want to hear from each of you for 5 minutes. And I will try surreptitiously next to you. I'll be sitting here next to you. And I have these really high-tech little cards that say 2 minutes and 0 minutes. And it's not like I'm going to, take the microphone away or bop you over the head. But I think that we need to be conscious of the time because we want to hear from everyone. And we're going to have everybody speak for 5 minutes. And then we will take a break, and we'll need a break, and have some refreshments, and then come back and talk with each other. We'll have a discussion. Alan Sekorn is here. He's going to help with that. He's going to be listening. We have other people that are listening, and then, of course, you'll be listening to each other, and we'll know that you'll have reactions, questions, comments, and the like. The restrooms are outside and down the hall to the left. Feel free to take a break when you need it, or get cookies or coffee when you need it. We're not sure we'll need them, but just to be safe, that would be the best. And then I'm going to pass around these cards.
Are we the donors or are we the witness?
I think you're the donor.
Okay, good.
If
The
sorry.
statement says you're signing as a donor.
So these are for your own note taking. If you want to take notes on what, you know, Jack or someone else said, so that you can remember it for the discussion period. So if you take one or two of these cards, this is nothing that we're gonna ask for or anything like that. It's just for your use. Dawn, we've asked Dawn to start, just kind of randomly, not completely randomly, Dawn. And he's gonna model the 5-minute. They want to get your part over with or whatever. And if you feel like you want to be next, just stand up and come up here. And if no one feels like it, I'll just start calling people or we'll go around the room. So we'll just work that out. It's a small group. So when it moves you to talk, please come up. It's going to take a little bit of, you know, we have to get people in and out of here, but we want to do that as, you know, in as smooth and quick a fashion as possible so that we can get through the taping.
Everybody, please be careful of the cords when you
Words and it's a few of them. Okay, and with that, Don Van Houten will introduce himself and tell us about his experience.
I'm Don Van Houten. I'm a retired professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. We were asked to say something about when did we first become opposed to the war. I can't remember not being opposed to the war. I won't go into all the reasons to be opposed to it. I suspect we all share those. We could go on in length about that. I engaged in all kinds of activities in opposition, one of which was electoral politics. Not very successfully, though. I first helped elect LBJ in 1964 on the premises that Goldwater might win and escalate the war in Vietnam and possibly drop nuclear bombs. Of course, right after he was elected, he did in fact, when LBJ was elected, he did in fact escalate the war, the troop levels dramatically. I then in 1972 was a treasurer of Lane County McGovern campaign, which was an exciting but of course quite futile effort again. When I got to Eugene, Carol and I got here in fall of 1968, a remarkably eventful year, of course. We engaged in all kinds of things. Of course, marches. We even took our small children on those. Teach-ins at the university. I engaged in leafleting and seeing one other person here. I remember being arrested with him and others for having leafleted at Valley River Center, at which time it was not yet illegal to leaflet at Valley River. Later it became illegal to leaflet there. I don't know what was the most productive activities at that time. The most counterproductive, I'm absolutely convinced, were the acts of violence, and Eugene was full of them. We had bombings on campus. PLC, the largest faculty office building, was badly damaged with a bomb in the women's room in the basement. There was a small bomb at Johnson Hall. Many of you may have forgotten that. It didn't do a lot of damage, but there was one. That's when central administration was there, but I think also the chancellor's office was there at that time. There's bombings at banks in Eugene. ROTC was burned. I think all those acts scared the populace, antagonized them. It just worked in the opposite direction of what we were trying to accomplish. One early morning, Steve may talk about this, Steve Deutsch got a call from President Clark of the university to come down to the student union to try to convince students not to engage in violence. So he and I at 3 a.m. went down to try to convince the students not to do that. You might have thought we were successful since there wasn't any violence that night, but I don't know that we had any effect whatsoever. All I remember clearest is a student yelling in my ear, "Are you with us or against us?" and doing it all night long. One of the things that was happening across the campus, across the country, was efforts by students to democratize the university and democratize course offerings, and that usually led to student-taught courses. I sponsored one of those on the University of Oregon campus in fall of 1970. It was called Critical Spirit. It looked at theorists, radical theorists like Marx and successors. And in the fall of that year, the FBI came to the department head of sociology and asked for the class list from that because they knew the name of a person who was in the class who did the bombing. They never said which of the bombings. The department head said, no, I'm not going to give you the class list. He had called central administration. They said, no, that's against policy. And further, why would you learn anything from a class list if you know the name of this person? After having been rejected there, they then went to central administration, who instead didn't ask how would this help. They got a news story from the FBI, which said it was an anonymous call. Somebody in that class knows who did the bombing. They, at that point, the president of the university, Clark, turned that class list over to the FBI. In January, early January, I and the department head wrote to the president, and then I leaked the whole story to the press. The president at that time claimed he'd gotten legal advice from his legal advisor about turning it over to the FBI. The legal advisor there is a name you all know, Dave Frommeyer. I was furious at him that he would give that advice, so I called him. I knew him. And Dave said, no, I never gave that advice. I only let him say that I had given him that advice. It was a black mark on President Clark. And it's unfortunate because he'd done a lot of wonderful things, including defending John Freund, who was an assistant professor of chemistry, and he became a Chicago 6, Chicago 7, depending on how you're counting, member. And Clark told me many, many years later that he had been fired by the board of the State System of Higher Education. In one meeting, the decision was tabled. The following month, they reversed that decision. So it was a terrible moment at the university. It was one of the most painful things I had ever experienced. What did I learn from all this? Well, I've become pretty radical on all lots of questions, which we can talk about later. Enough speaking.
Thanks. Thank you.
So just for your information, that was about 6 minutes. So,
I tried to move fast.
yeah, you did great. Just getting, like the feeling about what 5 minutes feels like. Okay, who's next?
Yes, first, because you'll understand.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you for allowing me to come here, Marion. And I'm here because I came through the side door. I didn't come. Well, I came because I married Ken Byland. And I was like 18 years old and I was pregnant and we were living at his parents' house. And he was going to the University of Oregon and he would come home and we were eating the food that Chet worked for and arguing over it was like being in the bunker residence, A little nerve-wracking. Chet would go, so what are they teaching you at that university? How to be a communist? And so it was kind of an intense time for the family. And my parents also were not in favor. They thought it was all horrible. So basically, he started getting involved in the Citizens for a Sane Foreign Policy and doing all these different things. He was really, really into it. And his whole line was, well, if you want to help, you can watch the kids because we're going to do the important stuff, which was Marion and everybody else. So that was my role, was to take care of the kids until Marion called me one day and said, what's going on here? And I said, well, So, and he wasn't a chauvinist. I mean, no, you could never call Ken a chauvinist for that kind of an attitude. But through all this, I did get involved, and I got involved in the women's movement and ended up with lifelong friends like Ellen and Jack Maddox and Marion and Stefan, and just a mirage of people that have supported us all over the years. And we need a lot of support, so. Anyway, it was a matter of, back then, we'd have these meetings, mimeograph flyers, stuffing envelopes, licking stamps, and doing the mailings. You had to lick the stamps back then. And I want to honor Dorothy Leeper and Margaret Runkle and Catherine Lawrence, and I can't remember anyway, Dorothy Leeper ran for Congress against John Dellenbach. And Bob Leeper, her husband, stood on the corner of Agate and Franklin with a sign in his sweet little overcoat and his hat that said, "Take my wife, please." It got on the news, it was a big deal, I loved it. And then all the fundraisers they'd have at their house, and they'd cook the salmon, and people would stand in a line going out that driveway where they lived on Agate Street. It would just be this long thing, Anyway, that's my involvement, Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Go, Margaret. In part to get it out of the way, I have some stories to follow up on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, my name's Ron Ekus. I was editor of the Oregon Daily Emerald in 1968-69 and student body president in 1970-71. I think it's good to start out with a couple of perspectives in talking about everything that happened. One is that the anti-war movement was not a monolithic movement. There were a lot of different organizations, a lot of different factions. There were community activists, there were campus activists, sometimes in sync, sometimes not. A lot of times, a lot of big arguments over strategies, tactics, and results. The other thing is that it wasn't just an anti-war movement, and that was alluded to before. There was a lot going on. There was a civil rights movement, there was a war on poverty, there was a student rights movement, and it all kind of came together in a period of time. It was a period of change, and it was a period of change in which being an activist in and of itself made you a radical. I didn't start the University of Oregon to be a radical. I started the University of Oregon to be a sports reporter. And I worked for the Oregon Daily Emerald as a sports reporter, moved to news, into the editorial page, and then eventually became editor. And then in 1968, in the summer, I'm working on the Omaha World Herald in an internship, watching the Democratic National Convention and the Prague Spring. And when I came back to campus, after the convention, the attitude in campus had definitely changed. The atmosphere had definitely changed. There's a lot of activity, but this was face-to-face activity, and sometimes in-your-face activity, and a lot of organizing and a lot of tension. It was also when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, had been shot before. But still, I'm chronicling this, working for the Oregon and the Oregon Daily Emerald. I'm not an activist. I'm not a participant. In fact, my first overt activity was a sit-in, sleep-in actually, in the porch of Johnson Hall, a group of students demonstrating to get a student's participation in the selection of a new president. Later that summer, it turned out that Charles Johnson, under a lot of pressure from the board and everything happening on campus, ended up being killed in an auto accident. And it sort of said it might be a little time to take some pressure off, but there was no time to take the pressure off. I still hadn't finished school, so I went from being from the Emerald to being an assistant with Kip Morgan in his student body presidency. And then Kent State in Cambodia happened. And I decided to run for student body president, teaming up with another assistant, Mike Commit. Kind of the irony here is that we decided we didn't want to run against each other, so we decided who was going to be student body president by a flip of the coin. But it was an intense time and one of the most contested elections and one of the highest turnouts But I got elected in the middle of the student strike after we had taken over the student union. And took over 13th, closed 13th Street, which was planned over a few beers at Maxie's Tavern to try and keep the momentum going. I remember a lot of other things in that year. I remember the bombing at PLC, and I actually got called to the FBI office. They had an anonymous letter that said I knew something. I told them I didn't, and if I did, I'd tell them, but that they ought to consider it might have easily been some right-wing fanatics as opposed to anti-war protesters that did the bomb. During the summer before, I had been part of the National Student Association, and we voted to send a delegation of students to South Vietnam to meet with South Vietnamese students. Sometime in November, John Freunds comes into my office and says, "Do you want to go to North Vietnam?" So I participated in a trip to North Vietnam because the South Vietnamese wouldn't let us into South Vietnam. The end result of that, though, was the People's Peace Treaty, which we brought back and was used as an organizing tool. I remember at one point, I think we were organizing a march down to the city council to support them voting for it. And we were told, or I was told, that we should not go ahead with the march, or we would be arrested because there had been other demonstrations that had created confrontations with police. We went ahead anyway, and we had a very peaceful march down to the city council, and I believe they eventually did pass that resolution. I recall the Student Faculty Coalition, another tactic, another strategy, and giving me 50,000 signed petitions that I could give to we gave to Senator Mark Hatfield in a big rally. And I look back on those times, and I've tried at times to try and explain it to people, and it's really hard. I remember going to a class with the son of a friend of mine years later to talk about Vietnam. And all I could do is say, look at one student, I said, all right, imagine that you get to go to college. Imagine that your best friend doesn't and gets drafted. Imagine, if you're a woman, that your brother is on the verge of getting drafted. Imagine that your parents might disown you because you oppose the war. Imagine that you've learned that the government has lied to you. Imagine that you are seeing pictures of the war and you are seeing people who have been napalmed. And that you've seen people, the result of cluster bombs. And imagine what it would be like if you were called a traitor. Now imagine veterans coming back from that war, and all of a sudden, when you're told you're unpatriotic, you have veterans saying, "I'm against the war." And I don't think the movement really took off. I think we had more losses than victories. What we did was mobilize people and change opinions. And I think one of the biggest things that happened was when the veterans came back and said, we're against the war too. The other thing that I want to add is that a really important thing was the interfaith council and the interfaith efforts that went on. Because this meant that this was a moral issue. So when you had the veterans and you had the religious faiths saying this war is wrong, that gave you the kinds of things you needed to continue the organizing and continue the movement.
Thank you.
I think I probably should go next since one of their sort of contemporaries. I grew up in Crestwell, Oregon, native Winther, and certainly didn't expect to get involved in the anti-war movement. My father was a disabled veteran, and I wanted to be a Green Beret until Kennedy got killed. Came to the University of Oregon with goals of making the Olympic team and getting a PhD in either economics or history. But along the way, I came to the conclusion that the war was a very, very bad idea, and the only way to stop the war was to end the draft. So, and I'm gonna use the word I a bunch of times, but it's actually a fairly good-sized group of which were somewhat interchangeable sometimes. So, the first thing I did was file a conscience objector claim, and I refused my student deferment. And during this period of time, it went very quickly, and there was only a few classes that had to go through what Ron and I had to go through, which was class of 65 out of high school, where in 66 they gave us all a test. Those who got less than a 70 got drafted. Then it was grades, then it was end of graduate student deferments. Each year, eventually they went to a lottery, which is a little more equitable, but there were still many ways out of the draft. Then I helped form a draft information center to provide the rules and regs to students so that they could avoid the draft using various bureaucratic trickery, I guess you could call it. Clinton is a perfect example of somebody who did it right. It turned politically, as it turns out. So along the way, a lot of things happened. I was involved in a set-in at the draft board in 1967 after picketing. Out of that, all of us got arrested, and we sort of, that group became some of the leaders of the anti-war and anti-draft movement. Kip Morgan joined our anti-draft group. The first thing that we did of any scale in Eugene was we hung a 28-foot long, 6-foot high sign that said Vietnam in red letters on Christmas Eve of 1967 from the cross. Unfortunately, it got smashed down by the police, and so nobody ever saw it. But the idea was when people got up for Christmas, they'd see Vietnam in these big red letters. So each way along the way, things would escalate in terms of what we were doing and in terms of what the war was doing. In the summer of '68, for example, my friends and I were on the front lines of the Chicago demonstrations. And Ron was absolutely right. It changed, the whole tone changed after the police riot that we went through. Refused induction in 1968 in October with a group, and we chained ourselves to the front of the draft bus. Kip took one wheel, I took the other, and then a woman named Marla Vanderwater was our spokesperson and did that sort of thing. Of course, the draft, they switched buses on us. We had 500 people at the Greyhound Depot, and we did what we did in front of the draft station. After that, we came up with the idea of arresting our draft boards for attempting to force us to commit war crimes. I know it's a stretch, but we couldn't get arrested. We kept trying. And so I didn't get arrested for refusing induction. I had too good a CO claim. Anyway, so Kip wrote up the indictment. I have a 20-page brochure that became a collage at that tofu and tie-dye thing that they had at the fairgrounds. Yeah, I got a lot of wall space out of this thing that I came up with about a week, way back in '69. Anyway, so Kip walked in and said they were under arrest. Kip started reading the indictment. My friend Blaine started discussing possible defenses. I brought the jury in. A policeman showed up, so we never got a chance to finish the indictment because I made a deal. We made our point. You know, they were just doing their jobs. That was so much fun. We did the Eugene draft board the next week. In the middle of that, the fellow who had, as it turns out, had stopped me from getting my conscience objector rating, got up from the table and physically attacked Kip. He turned red. He was about 70 years old at the time. I was afraid he was going to have a heart attack, and so I adjourned at that point. The closest we came to an actual trial was a week later. The Navy recruiters, and we found him not guilty by reason of insanity. But out of all of that, we finally got arrested. There was a group that was sort of known as the Eugene 7, and Kip and I were kind of the leaders of it. And then while we were out on bail, we elected him student body president. I'm sure he has the NCAA record for being out on bail for 7 felonies. Many of them not very nice. I don't have time to go into all the details. while we were being arraigned, the federal judge, Solomon, ironically, flipped out on me. I did a 10-day fast, got the judges changed. That judge threw the case out. That judge got appointed to the Ninth Circuit, so we got the third judge. There were only 3 of them. And then he turned out to be a good trial judge. While I was fasting, I came up with the idea of Kubduga Bookstore. How many people remember that store? My book's spelled backwards. And that sort of kept me out of trouble for the summer at least. And then my brother, while he was buying books in San Francisco, got the original Rolling Stone distribution for the United States for bookstores. So at one point we had 400 accounts across the country. I was still out of bail. You normally don't start a business when you're out of bail, from what I've been told. But we were so young, we didn't know any better. And then eventually I had to go serve my time. And we were supposed to go over to the coast and plant trees. The guy in charge of that didn't like our file, so he went to Lompoc Federal Correctional. We were supposed to be there 18 months, which would have got me back in time to file for city council, which is something I intended to do. But Lieutenant Calley got convicted of war crimes, so our case had some sort of validity to it, and we got out early. In the process of trying to convince a judge to let us out early, my cousin, who had been drafted because he took a health class and dropped him from 12 credit hours to 11, who got shot in Vietnam because he took a health class, unfortunately, stormed into the judge's office and yelled at the federal judge. You'd be surprised how much time you get now for doing it. But he got away with it. And so it was just a whole different era. It's kind of really hard to explain. And things, so many different things are going on simultaneously, and so many people were involved, either part-time or full-time or more than full-time. And I did run for city council, and at the end of the campaign, Ed Fadley was able to get my conviction set aside. So I thought I was home free at that point. Turns out the FBI didn't take it off my record. I got fired 3 times for 20 years, until finally somebody showed me my rap sheet. And I got the paperwork together. I talked to Sidley's, that's the former U.S. attorney, who's a friend of mine, who was the prosecutor. He said, just take it to the FBI. So I go to the FBI with my paperwork. And the agent says, oh, I've been waiting 20 years to do something like this. Sure, I'll take care of it. Well, thank you for the last 20 years. And so those are some of my experiences. And hopefully I did this in 5 minutes. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
Great.
Great.
My name's Gary Tepfer, and I want to thank people who organized this. I think it's a great idea. And some of the things I'll talk about will actually tie into some of the other comments people have made. I guess I can thank my parents for my pacifist feelings and orientation as a child. I don't know where they came from, except if they didn't come from attitudes within our household. My mother always said that my grandfather was a pacifist. He left Germany as a 15-year-old, so he wouldn't have to serve in the army. And I suppose that was a model for me. And I took it very seriously from a very early age. I remember getting thrown out of class in the 7th grade at Roosevelt Junior High School, arguing with the teacher about Vietnam. This is 1963. No, 62, yeah, 63. It happened regularly, and she'd throw me out. She'd say, we'd have to stop the communists over there or else they'd be on our shore. And I'd say, we're supporting a puppet regime, and so forth and so on. And I just kept getting thrown out till my parents had to go and Sharon Gordon was in that class, by the way. My parents finally had to intervene with the teacher and say, look, lay off him. He's starting to get nuts about this. So I got a lot of help from, when I was 12 years old, from Lou Nyman, who was the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel. And he, in my bar mitzvah training, he steered me to to Jewish pacifists and the Jewish background of pacifism, especially Stephen Weiss. And that ultimately served me extremely well in the long run because I had a track record of being a pacifist. And when it came time to apply it as a conscientious objector, he was able to stand up and say, this guy was a pacifist when he was 12 years old. In high school, there were a group of us that were organized informally against Vietnam and the Vietnamese War, and we were incensed by the fact that we had to go to a organized program with military recruiters, and they were invited into the high school. We all had to go, and they told us our duty to our country under the Selective Service Law. And I remember 4 of us, I think Ann Tattersall, Phil Atney, Ben Egger, and myself went to the principal and said, "You're not explaining one part of the law. You can't do that. You can explain, if you're going to explain our duty to military service, you have to explain the non-military alternative." And his answer I remember very clearly. He said, "Not in my school." And so we went to Joe Richards, who was a prominent lawyer in town, and Joe drafted a letter for us, sent it to the superintendent of schools, Millard Pond, and said that unless this changes, we're going to sue. And the end result was very quickly a letter from Millard Pond saying there will be no military recruiters in the high schools from here on. So that was one of the few successes. When I did turn 18, or as I did, I applied for CO status, and I got the status, which was quite surprising since no one else got it, including a lot of other very qualified people. So, and I would really credit the letter from Lou Nyman for that, and also the track record I had of pacifism going back several years. And I did get involved in an organization, maybe some of you have heard of it. I think it was called CCCO, Committee for Conscientious Objectors. And the purpose of that was to promote education about non-military option, and then sitting down with people that wanted to apply to be conscientious objectors and to help them with their case. So we did that for several years, and quite a few of these people we were dealing with were people that had just got the word they're going to be drafted. And it was kind of too late for them because at that moment their chances weren't good, but we tried. Another thing I got involved with was an organization that tried to keep demonstrations and peace rallies from going violent. And I think what provoked this, or what prompted this, was the burning of the ROTC building. When we realized, as a group of us, that we're hoping for a peace rally, all of a sudden this was getting violent, and there were people, we started to realize that there were agents provocateurs that were trying to push this into a violent demonstration that it wasn't intended on being, and we started realizing who they were. And so we started an organization, and we actually had some training on how to turn a potentially nonviolent, how to keep a violent demonstration or a nonviolent demonstration from becoming violent. So there's one more thing I'll talk about, and then I'll end. And that was an outreach program. This is when I was a student. This is when Ron Ekus was president of the student body. And it was a group of us that were going out into the community to try to explain our anti-war message to community groups. And these were informal groups of a dozen people perhaps in someone's living room, and we would go and try to convince them that this war was a mistake for us and so forth and so on. And I would say exactly what Ron said, and that was that as a conscientious objector and as peace activists, we were not very effective at this. I mean, we could talk until we're blue in the face, but we weren't effective until we started combining with veterans from the war. And when we had returning veterans, and we went into people's houses, that really made a difference. That's when it really became effective. And I can remember two in particular. One was a kid that was in high school with me, and I don't know if we should be mentioning names, probably not. I think I'll leave his name off. I remember him saying at age 17 he couldn't wait to join the Army and shoot books. And he went to Vietnam, he was disillusioned, came back, and he was one of our very best people. Because he could go into these living rooms and he could say how bad the war was and how bad what we were doing was, in a way that people could understand. And a second one was a sergeant who had been in Vietnam, who was spellbinding also. He was so convincing. So that's the piece I wanted to mention.
My name is Geraldine Helton. Some of the things Don's already referenced. Sort of my first political involvement was canvassing for Johnson in 1964 when I was very pregnant. But it seemed really important to do because it sure looked like gold. Like otherwise we were going to be into a hot war in a hot minute. So of course we all know what happened down the road. So that was a very disillusioning moment for me. Then in 1968, early 1968, Don got hired at the University of Oregon and we were leaving Indiana and getting ready to move here. As been mentioned, 1968 was a very eventful year in April with Martin Luther King being killed, and then the day we sold our house in Indiana to get ready to move here was to a family that we liked very much and we connected with, was the day that Bobby Kennedy was shot. So that was that kind of hello. And then we were driving across country with our 3 little children during the police riot, during the convention in Chicago. Kind of in touch with what was going on and only getting bits of it, but getting the idea of just how horrible this was. So we got here. In Indiana, it hadn't been very politically active, so I wasn't particularly doing anything, but I got here and I don't remember who I met first, but it was probably Marion. And with our preschool kids, it seems like several times a week there was something that we were involved with doing and planning besides the various marches that usually came from the campus. We took our preschool children with us on many of these things. And one of the funny things that happened is that they kind of learned that if they didn't want to do what their dad and I wanted to do, they could sit in the back seat and say, no more, whatever. That was also a time when, of course, the war was on TV, on the regular news, because the reporters had access to what was really happening. So one of the things I wanted to share has to do with the personal thing for me. I remember very clearly driving a car on 24th Street right by then Roosevelt, then junior high, with one of my sons in the car, in the front seat, of course, back then. And he looked up at me and said, when I grow up, will I have to go to war? And that really crystallized something for me about my personal commitment. I had all these intellectual ideas. I was very much against the war and, the various mottos out there. If you're not part of the solution, you're the problem. If you, but for me, that really, it really deepened it. That it was my job to do what I could to change things. I share with what some people have said that it's hard to know whether we were successful or not. I think I have to credit Marion for always saying, it's really important to keep doing what you can do. So that's what I have tried to do.
Thank you. Dennis, do you want to go? 'Cause you have to leave?
Hi, my name is Dennis Culver, and in the whole spectrum of folks, I probably earned something of a reputation of being a hardcore leftist. And so let me just begin by sharing my chance to engage in violent acts. And one night I got a call, and somebody offered that I could go to a mailbox and pick up a lot of dynamite, and they hoped that I would blow up the cross. And frankly, I thought it was the FBI who had regularly called my wife over the years to try to get her to testify against her parents, which was sort of a non-issue. It was just harassment. So all of these things are pretty complicated. I just thought I'd say that. I, like a lot of other people, came to Eugene in 1968 to attend graduate school in physics at the U of O. Before that time, my then wife and I went to Fresno State, and we were leaders in a Friends of SNCC group with the goals of desegregating schools in a very segregated place, which Fresno was, and also organizing farm workers in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley with the then Farm Worker Organizing Committee, the precursor to the United Farm Workers, in some very successful consumer boycotts at the time. As we were leaving, an SDS chapter was forming with an anti-imperialist kind of outlook on the war in Vietnam. But I was accepted at UCSB in Santa Barbara, and I stayed there for about a year, but frankly, my heart was in political activism, and the physics department there recognized it, and so I searched for another thing to do, and I ended up applying to U of O with the thought that I would both be a serious activist and a serious physics student, both, and get through school, and then allow my wife, who was also a leader in her own right and a person of color, to have her shot at school, which she eventually did. So when we came here, that was a year when the country really did change, as other people were saying. It was just remarkable. At Santa Barbara, this is one of the many things I was going to leave out, but Wayne Morris spoke at UCSB, and the reception was just wild, and it was deep, and Morris, you could see, oh, I can't believe it. Okay, he was taken back by it. He was shocked. He could see, he was in this uphill fight, and all of a sudden, that's what it was. I'll tell you how I got involved, which I think is really important. When I came here, I saw the anti-draft work, I saw just anti-war activism, and I also saw these student anti-war activists connected with the labor movement in really amazing ways. And I attended one big rally, and Ken Byland was there, right?
Doesn't surprise me.
The president he was the president of the Labor Council at the time, and he gave this roaring speech, really a union organizing speech, saying, you students, you need to organize a union to stop the war. And that's the call that I took up, and built my activity around that. And that activity was has pushed the boundaries of thinking. We said, look, students, we shouldn't just be opposed to the policy and uniting with people that oppose the policy, we should be in solidarity with people who were opposing the implementation of that policy, and that meant solidarity with the people in Vietnam fighting against U.S. forces. And we organized around that, and in my little bit of time, I should mention a variety of things, but much creativity involved. And there was a women's sewing circle that was developed, in which there was feminist consciousness raising, and also National Liberation Front flags were produced. And I brought one there. Maybe somebody could bring it over here. And so people, you know, so in the very colorful demonstrations, these kind of things were quite often, you know, of course, an act of treason in many people's eyes, but also sort of eye-opening and very well made, if you.
Terrible.
And as I think Ron said something about this, there were really varieties of directions to the movement, and some people were confined just on campus, some people were defined off campus, alienated from the campus, and then other people spanned the two, and that's the group that I was in. Eugene had this reputation of being the Berkeley of the Northwest, but we played a different role than Berkeley did, because as soon as people got active here, the reigning radical dogma was that you needed to go to the big cities, and so activists would be sort of built here, and they would go to Seattle, or most likely San Francisco, Oakland, or LA, or San Diego, or sometimes Chicago and New York. So it was actually the rare person with an activist background who came to Eugene to live at that time. Oh, you know, like, what a pleasure, because we lose so many people. And then finally, let me just say one more thing. The starting of the labor movement and the involvement, like Ken, what did this come out of? I think something for the record. There was quite a wise leader in the labor movement here, and I'll leave out the name. But he was putting out a newsletter, an anti-war newsletter, and basically, given the spirit of the Building Trades Council, of which he was a part of, from Portland, came down and told him, we're going to kill you if you don't stop that. It was just like that. That was a reflection of the raw, you know, of what was going on in this country, and I don't think we should be really ignoring that. You know, people were assassinated. You know, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, and a number of people like that. And I guess maybe I'll save my other comments for later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. My name is Rachel Jordan, and we were only in Eugene from 1970 to 72. So my anti-war opposition started a lot before that and continued afterwards. I came by it honestly. My father voted for Norman Thomas at least 4 times. And his sister, my aunt, had her wages garnished because she protested during World War II, which was very rare, and marched in the first scene, marches in Cleveland. But we came from Berkeley, where we had participated in rallies and some really big marches in San Francisco to protest the war. We came here, my husband was working on his doctorate at the U of O, and I was home with 3 small children, taking care of my children. Somewhere along the line, I met Marion, who got me away from my home.
And through her, I became involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was a real important group in Eugene at that time in the anti-war movement. We held at least weekly vigils downtown and some marches through downtown Eugene. And I almost always took my children. I called my daughter, my oldest daughter, I thought she might remember something. She said, I remember being in a plaza and handing out flyers. She said it was really fun, but I had no idea what I was doing. But they caught on eventually. There was one traveling exhibit we set up that really moved me, and it was paintings by children from Laos, and it was paintings of their view of the world. They were living in caves to protect them from U.S. bombing, and their view of the world was a sky full of planes and bombs. And I remember being angry because so many people passed by and didn't even bother to look at it. And I wanted to say, pay attention, this is important. It was very important to me to have an outlet to express my opposition to the war, and through Miriam and the Women's International League, I could do that, and I don't know how effective we were, but I still feel it was important. And it was very satisfying being with a group of dedicated people every week, always doing something. I did compose a few letters to the editor, but I don't think any of them were published. And I contacted my congressmen and other officials, which I continue to do. Who knows if that does any good. My feelings about the war at that time were based on the evil I saw my country doing to a small country that was trying to shake off all traces of colonialism, and had been for years, and destroying the environment with toxic chemicals and murdering people with horrible methods. That was my main involvement. I wasn't at that time too concerned about our soldiers. I knew they were young and mainly uneducated, but they could be taught to follow orders and to kill. And I didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for them. But years later, I worked in a VA hospital for 10 years in alcohol and drug program and PTSD programs. We had mostly Vietnam vets. We had some from Korea and a few even from World War II. And I became very much more in depth aware of the consequences of war on the people that are in the front lines and actually do the fighting, what it does to them. And I could talk about that all day, but that was at a later time. So I think that's all I have.
When I got here, 1961, you see, which is somewhat earlier than the years that people have been talking about so far. One was that. 2, the antiphonal reading of Ginsberg's Howl to protest the free speech right firing. Someone was involved in that. 3, Arthur Fleming's permitting Gus Hall to come and be laughed at Hayward Field. And 4, some small but intense protests against housing discrimination against blacks, honchoed by CORE. Honor, if memory serves, goes to Clyde DeBerry and Jim Panoski, as I remember for that. Of course, we all were thinking about race in those years, more on a national than a local level. That's why I went to Fisk there at the tail end of the first phase of the civil rights struggle. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act as I arrived in Nashville. James Meredith was marching across Mississippi as I drove back in 1956. In Nashville, we did various protest marches on the civil rights front, but I remember taking a substantial group of Fisk students to a teach-in against the war at Vanderbilt, though I didn't have the maturity or organizational skills to follow up, and that was the only time I remember Fisk-Vanderbilt interaction, if a block of black faces in a sea of white could be called interaction. But it felt to me back in Eugene, and feels now looking back on it, as if everything changed in that year. Of course, for me, with a new African-American wife, race continued to be a main concern, as it was in Eugene as a whole. This, after all, was the time of the Black Panthers. But in some ways, the war in Vietnam underlay it and everything else. University governance, curricular reform, sex, drugs, rock and roll. There is something holistic, although also pathetic, about my film students and I doing some kind of guerrilla theater routine outside PLC in response to the shootings at Kent State and Jackson State. We brandished our copies and quoted from Mao's Little Red Book, as we had learned to do from Godard's La Chinoise, which we completely misunderstood. A scene which would have been completely inconceivable in 1962. I was not a honcho of the Eugene anti-war movement per se, in the way I was a honcho of the sanctuary movement 15 years later. But here again, there's linkage. When I returned to Religion and Friends Meeting and the project of Sanctuary beckoned, where Karen Hemmingson and I only naturally turned was to Marion, Malcolm, and Cal, which for me, no matter what the name changes are, will always be clergy and laity concerned about the war in Vietnam. Not the original title, no, quite. The organizational skills to build an interfaith coalition with national and international connections were there waiting at Cal, which would not have been the case without the war in Vietnam. In the best possible way, for once we can say what goes around comes around. It's amazing how unrecoverable specific moments of anti-war action are for me. Doing a presentation at some church, though I was no expert, a good number of marches downtown carrying signs and chanting, more teach-ins and the like at the Herb, of which I was observer, not presenter. The most memorable scene that comes to the surface was in that court at one of the moratorium days. I picture it with candles, though maybe not. Someone slowly read the list of UO students killed in Vietnam, and for each name those who had known the person were to rise and remain standing. By the end of the list, an astounding number of people were standing there, and it brought home to me, like nothing else, the personal cost of the war. Though even here, a certain irony intrudes. We were not at that point reading the names of Vietnamese dead. A general lesson, General Washington said that men act from their interests and their passions, and I think both have to be involved for a mass movement like the anti-war movement, or the American Revolution, to succeed. If not for the draft and for the quite real prospect of being sent off against one's will to die in Vietnam, the passions of the nation, especially of its youth, would not have been engaged. And you can't do it again unless everyone, or huge numbers at least, feel their own ox to be seriously gored. The passions of the virtuous are mighty, maybe even necessary, but insufficient. For climate change, for somewhat limited wars of aggression in countries far away, for the unattractive dominance of gated communities, such as the one our own district attorney lives in, and the other antics of the 1%, for the revelation of the police as an occupying power in the lives of the 10% who are of color, not a chance. The mighty are clever and will prevail. I no longer take solace in Che Guevara's saying, struggle and defeat, struggle and defeat, struggle and defeat, on to victory. Sorry to be negative, but somebody's got to be sometime.
1964, my young family and I were living in Cleveland, Ohio. And our first protest against the Vietnam War was with my faculty colleague, famous baby doctor Benjamin Spock. And in the spring of 1964, there were very few pieces of information about Vietnam out there. But there were people in the Friends meeting, and Ben Spock and a few others, who were better informed and recognizing that things were brewing in a way that was very distressing. And so Beth Deutsch and our two little children, and I'm sorry I lost my wife recently. Forgive me. So we participated in a march into downtown Cleveland, and it was quite well attended. And the majority of the people outside the media really were asking the question, well, what's going on in Vietnam? Why are you marching? What's the protest? What's going on? Most Americans at that time had no concept of what was really going on. There was some American military there. And of course, by August of 1964, that really changed with the Tonkin Bay Resolution and the heroism of Wayne Morris and Ernest Graining, the two United States senators, to oppose that resolution. By the next spring of 1965, I was part of an International League for Peace and Freedom and other things in this room. And I particularly, I think, honor the younger ones in this room because you were the ones in a different kind of courage standing up against what was there for Vietnam. I wasn't that much older, but significantly older than those of you who were students who were putting yourselves in jeopardy in terms of being eligible for the draft and all the things that came of it. And I honor you and I respect you immensely.
Arriving here in 1966 was amazing. Charlie Porter was running for Congress. Hatfield was running for the United States Senate. Morris was already in the United States Senate. It felt like I was leading a right-wing state, Ohio, and moving to a progressive new America. It was blessed. It was wonderful. I think that CALC has been an absolutely incredible organization in the half-century since. And I think the thing I'd like to end with is really a comment of enormous respect for everybody in this room. For those who early on in the days in opposition to the Vietnam War understood the travesty that it was. You didn't have to have Morris's intellect to understand the constitutional issues. You didn't have to have the particulars about the geography. But people understood early on in this place more than most rest of the United States. And I think this is a tradition that we really need to honor of what was here then and what's continued, and makes this a very special place.
I'm Ellen Maddox. Jack and I came here also in '66. It was then I met Marion, I met Beth, I met a lot of other fabulous women who formed Rotc. We came here and did not know if Jack would get his deferral because he made the mistake of getting his doctorate with our first child. But it was also liberating because we left the South, where we were arrested in civil rights demonstrations, where we both had conditional sentences. Jack, being a native Southerner, had a 6-month conditional sentence. I was not a native Southerner. I grew up in Atlanta, where I had been demonstrated the first time, not against segregation then, but it was with people from Martin Luther King's office against the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from there, I went to graduate school where I met Jack in North Carolina. And coming out here was wonderful. It was so liberating politically after being in the South. Jack and I got arrested in that Valley River, picketing the guns. And, I don't even remember who was babysitting our kids. And Jack and I mean, we were so dumb, didn't think to have bail money with us. But somebody had cash and got us out of there. It was a very intense time, but it was a time when you felt surrounded by people who cared, people who had broader concerns than what I so frequently see today among students, among the general society. Maybe it was coming out of the being involved in civil rights, coming here and immediately being involved in the anti-war movement. I have always said that is what saved me, because I would have been so alone. Jack was on campus. I was a young pregnant woman who knew nobody. But the people I met were probably the finest people I will ever know in my life, particularly Beth Deutsch. But they were all good people. The people we've mentioned, like Dorothy and a lot of other people. Our kids
particularly our son, knew nothing else because the anti-war movement consumed my life. When we were in Washington, D.C. for what was known as the last coming of Richard Nixon, we happened to be nearby in Chapel Hill, so we came up for the counter-inauguration, which was to be the last demonstration against the war. Our son, who was then 6 years old, said, "Mommy, it can't be the last demonstration against the war. There's always been a war in Vietnam." It's all he knew. I came to the vigil 4 days before he was born, and everybody left the vigil and moved us into a rented house from our two folks, because it was our society and we took care of each other.
Follow up.
The day that we're recording,
Say your name.
I'm Jack Maddox. I'm a retired history professor. I'm with Ellen. On the day that we're recording these, the University of Oregon campus is blanketed with posters for Vietnam Night. The kids, young Vietnamese people who are putting out these posters in the Vietnamese Students Association have chosen as their theme a reminiscent "Once Upon a Time." And from the pictures that are on the posters, it's evident that the time that they think of as formative for their identity is probably sometime during the Lei Dynasty, hundreds of years ago. Comparing and contrasting this with the perspectives that we are bringing to this, where we're looking really at only 50 years or a little less back. Yes, I, like Ellen, came here in 1966. Not at all welcomingly to the South. There are many things I like better about the South. But I had been part of different socialist movements from about 1962 in college. I had the town clerk in Princeton accuse me of inciting to riots simply because of a leaflet we were going to hand out at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had been involved in quite a number of radical activities, academic and activist. And one thing about these dates you hear, when we're talking about the anti-war movement in Eugene, it sounds like one blur when you give it all together. Every year was significantly different from the year before it and the year after, especially on campus, but even off campus. The organizations involved, the kind of activities involved, the kind of community reception, the community spirit. Every single one of those years you have to recognize is different from the other, with the summers, usually even off campus, being where you would make the transition point from one year to another. In 66, 67, a number of really interesting things happened. We did indeed start, and it's only been mentioned when Ellen briefly brought it up, a weekly vigil on Saturday afternoons, I believe, at the park blocks. Saturday morning? Okay. It started out pretty big, but there were some rugged souls who kept, when it got down to half a dozen people, nevertheless kept showing up for, I believe, several years. By then it had been dwarfed by many other activities. The off-campus, the faculty-student group with parallel leaderships that was around the year before. Okay. I'm worried that I may have let Steve down. CalCAV was not one of the things that I was particularly active in, which is ironic since I was a believing Christian and a church member and strongly anti-war.
And your minister was one of those names I was given, Norm Pott.
Norm Pott.
He was
Norm
the
Pott
chair.
was of value there. I was a religiously motivated activist, but was following a Marxian social science view that led me in political activity not to talk about the religion that I was thinking about all the time. And that is one of the reasons why I've always doubted that historical research will ever quite add up to the total of how heavily involved, how heavily the heavy religious motivation was in the movements of the 60s. Already out of time? Okay, I had some stories to tell, but
Tell one.
I want to talk about the Valley River Five again.
Well, Don mentioned it,
Yeah.
and I alluded to
Yeah,
it.
it's, that one's been done. In 69, 70, I was pretty heavily called on by the people in SDS, which was then being taken over by the Revolutionary Union, to speak at their rallies because they could count on, I think looking back on it, they could count on me to say things that would always be pointing toward revolutionary overthrow of the existing government. On the other hand, they knew that when I would say things that were trying to distinguish between my politics and theirs, I would be so incomprehensible as to be totally ineffective. It was, and there was an evening that I guess Ron will remember when we actually did get the university closed down after Kent State in 70, which was during Parents' Weekend.
Yeah.
And therefore they turned all the Parents' Weekend activities student groups did into educational anti-war activities. And Ron and I were in Mac Court speaking along with President Robert Clark to
Love one another. I was in a Methodist school. Later, it would become the principles of democracy, like justice for all. Why didn't anyone at this Methodist school want to talk to me about these things? I had a spiritual crisis and decided the church was full of hypocrites, and it would be about 20 years before I would even consider being part of a spiritual community again. I felt lied to and alone, confused and depressed. I flunked out of school and came back to Eugene. My parents didn't know what to do with me. But I was fortunate. They kept the lines of communication open, and they had a teacher at the university who let me read a book called Alienated Youth and write a paper on it. I did that. And I was fortunate because of that opportunity and that privilege. I got to spend the next few years with one foot at the University of Oregon and the other foot in the community as one of those sex, drugs, rock and roll, hippie musicians. So I was in the community, I was singing, I was being a young person, but I wasn't in it just for the party. But I found common cause and community with my musician friends. We started out singing folk music at the Fridays of 4 at the Student Union. And then the older brother of one of our bandmates came up from San Francisco to manage our band. So that brought a lot to us. I think I will never, ever, ever forget the moment that I heard the 7 o'clock news on a scratchy radio in a car. I was riding around with some friends. Do you remember that? Remember that? The 7 o'clock news, Simon and Garfunkel? they're singing Silent Night, and the news starts out soft, and it builds and builds and builds, all these things that are going on. Well, I didn't know about those things. So I got some questions. Who was Lenny Bruce? Who was Martin Luther King? Why was our society so violent and materialistic? Why was our country fighting in Vietnam? Anyway, the guy from San Francisco, he brought up some new music, the Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish, who delivered some really in-your-face messages that we could play for our parents. And I did that. Didn't go over really well. But also our San Francisco connection, because maybe there was race stuff going on on the campus, but it wasn't going on anywhere else in Eugene. So I knew nothing about poverty or the black culture or anything until this guy. And this man actually tied an environmental destruction too on Mercy, Mercy Me. Remember that? Remember these songs? Fantastic. And Holly Near came to town, and she really helped us. Her music helped connect me directly with the people on the ground in Vietnam. What was life like for them? Because I didn't watch the news much on TV. I just wasn't doing that. But through the music, I understood. Thanks to my dad again, provided me an opportunity to work with Lois Barton at what you call the Peace Center. I just knew it as the World Without War Council. I learned about Gandhi. I got to hang out with some elders and hear conversation about politics and social change. There was a presentation on Cole's levels of moral reasoning, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're really up against something really big to try to change hearts and minds and politics and policies in this country. And I thought, I got to go back to school and learn political science. So I did that. Because all we need is love? No, we needed a lot more than that. We needed to work for change from the inside too. So my first mainstream political work was being a precinct committee person with the Lane County Democrats in the 1974 primaries. Wayne Morse was trying to regain a Senate seat, and it was my first time going door to door, talking with people, encouraging them to be an active citizen, stay involved, that mattered. I got married for the first time on August 10th, 1974, the day after Nixon resigned. And then I moved to Portland in 1977 for the diversity, for the energy. I try to be that woman that Holly Near was singing about. I became a public education activist, working to make all schools better for all kids. Took a special interest in minority communities, particularly the Vietnamese, who came over shortly after I moved up to Portland. The boat people came into Portland. So I found a faith that works for me about 20 years ago, Unitarian Universalism. And I got into faith-based and values-based community organizing, and I'm still doing that.
Yeah, 5 minutes. I'm Marion Malcolm. I think I want to start with something pretty fundamental that I learned at some point during the war that's affected the whole rest of my life. And it's in the speech that we'll be reading on Sunday from Martin Luther King, where he talks about the war is but a symptom of a far deeper malady. And what I think a lot of us understand during the war is that the war was not an aberration. The war was a direct result of the role that the United States was intent upon playing in the world, and that was the role of, you know, it's all those words that end with ISM, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, and my government was right in the middle of that. What that meant, ironically, was I was going to be doing something like what I was doing during the Vietnam War the entire rest of my life. I didn't know then that I was going to end up doing it as a job working for Culver most of my adult life, but I knew I'd be doing it at least as a volunteer. And what was said to me was that it was actually okay to take a weekend off. It was okay to go on vacation because there was no way to sustain if you didn't do some of those things that restored you as you went along. I think that's why I haven't ever burned out, because in fact I do those kind of normal things And I'm really glad that I had a family, that I have a family, because I think otherwise I might have been a fanatic, and I think then I would have been a bad organizer because people would have run when they saw me coming. I think it's really important to have some of that normal stuff in our lives. Like several others, I moved here in the late summer of 1966, and like I guess a number of us in this room, we were very quickly at a protest on the occasion of the visit of Hubert Humphrey. He spoke at Hayward Field. He earned my everlasting dislike at that point when he referred to those of us who were very politely protesting with a few signs, and he talked about that sideshow over there. So, people have already mentioned, I think, Citizens for a Sane Foreign Policy. It's a local community-based group that we formed. We did the usual array of things other people have talked about. Weekly vigils, those were in the park blocks. Later they were in what's now the downtown mall. In fact, I think we leafleted on the mall while they jackhammered up the street to make the mall, and then when they made it. And then by then most of us had kids, so we were actually very glad to have a traffic-free place for our weekly vigils. Mostly I opposed the war as a woman, and from the time when my son was born in 1969, I opposed the war as a mother. And I connected, I think, on a very deep level with what I imagine the war must be like for women in Vietnam, and also for mothers of people whose sons were in the military. And so Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was, for a number of those years, the organization that I most worked with. Whoops, oh, 2 minutes. And we did things like raising funds for women in Vietnam, but working with the group was wonderful, and I think a couple of people have referenced this already, because we gave each other so much support. There were older women in there who supported the younger women. We traded off leadership according to who most recently had a baby. We had childcare at our meetings. Sometimes it kind of looked like La Leche League, in fact. We had so many babies in the room. And my kids grew up in the movement, and I don't think that hurt them one single bit. But one time my mother-in-law came to visit, and she said to my son, who might have been 3 or 4 at the time, that she had a little time to play with him, and what would he like to play? And he said, he would like to play Demonstration. So she said, well, how do you play that? And he's marching around the living room, peace now, peace now, peace now. And I'm kind of glad that he's not saying 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your effing war, or ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, and all that is bound to win. Because she had a son and 2 sons-in-law, my brothers-in-law, who took turns of being on tours of duty in Vietnam in 3 different branches of the military, and one of those brothers-in-law died many years later, but his name should be on the wall because he died ultimately from his experiences in the war. We also worked with veterans from early on. I hated when people try to imply that the peace movement was always against veterans. And I agree with the people that have already spoken and said that it was the veterans' opposition to the war that ultimately made a huge amount of difference. One thing we did together, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, late in the war when the Saigon government was imprisoning anybody who spoke against the war in any way, shape, or form, is we went into a city council meeting and we arrested Wix Beale, who was a city councilwoman who had been to the Paris peace talks, and we arrested Les Anderson, who was then the mayor, but because we told them ahead of time we were going to do it. In fact, we got a great anti-war statement from Les. I have to tell one more story that has Ron in it. 1 minute. 0 minutes. Big demonstration downtown. Wix Beale is supposed to speak. Les Anderson is supposed to speak. Rotc is supposed to speak. He's just back from North Vietnam. I'm the moderator, 7 months pregnant. I'm the moderator of this whole rally. That's when the mall had that upper layer on it, that balcony layer. Yeah. So some of Ron's buddies come up and they think the NLF flag should go up. And Wix Beale is pacing back and forth saying, if that flag goes up, if that flag goes up, the mayor won't be able to speak if that flag goes up. So Ruth Carson and I are holding the hem of the Viet Cong flag, which I was kind of fond of myself, and negotiating. No, it can't go up now. you could put it up right before Ron speaks, but not before the mayor speaks. And so that all worked out. I wanted to talk about a lot of things.
It goes fast.
5 minutes.
And
ain't what it
then,
used to be.
Glenn. And then Dan.
My name is Ruth Koenig, and I too came in '66. But just had 1 year in graduate school and then began teaching. So when I think about war or the war, it is still the war to me. Of Berlin and one in the countryside of Poland, experiencing those horrors and sharing with me their time. Years later, it wasn't that I thought I could make a difference, but there was nothing within me that could understand how anything like that could happen. And so, in the summer of '64, I'd been sent information about Freedom Summer, and I went to Mississippi. So that was the turning point in my life, and I could never, ever look again at this country, at my religion, other than a very critical, in a very critical way. And Debbie's passion felt very much like mine. Maybe driven by a lot of anger, feeling that I'd been lied to. You said it that way, and I think that's how I felt also. I felt that way also about my German heritage, by the way. And then had to sift through and find heroes who had risked in Germany, and heroes who had risked also in I went to Mississippi in '64. In '65, I studied cultures of Southeast Asia back at my little college in central New York, Cortland. And that changed everything about my attitude relating to Vietnam. Because people were asking me in '64, what do you think about that war? And I said, I don't know enough to have an opinion. That changed everything. And my group had Vietnam that we were supposed to concentrate on as graduate students that summer. And my part had to be the war, and I didn't want that, but that was the only way that I could make the meeting. And that's how I learned. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. These people would love to join with the North Vietnamese because they've been pushed and pushed and pushed till they're almost in the sea. They need that identity. And the U.S. was doing that. That's where my understanding began. So Vietnam in Eugene, I remember very well, in particular Marion's mom, because she would call me all the time about the WILF meetings, Gene Shoot. And I remember so well Marion and Steve and Dan. And going to all the rallies, going to the marches, being troubled by the bombings. I want to tell you a funny story because it's easier to do that and then not cry, because a lot of you have said things that have had me really close to those tears. I taught at Monroe Middle School. It was very conservative. It was hard to be there. Thankfully, a woman who is now Misa Jo became a very close friend, was in my wedding, I was in her sister's wedding. She came in eventually. But anyway, one morning, I taught physical education at that time. I was studying English at the university, but that's what I studied, that's what I taught there. And this young woman that some of you will remember, and some of you have heard her on the air on NPR for many years, and now you can still hear her sister's name, Paula Grant. Her sister Neva is still on NPR. Paula came running by my office in the morning, and she just called me, "Hey, Miss Koenig, guess what? We're having a sit-in today." no, wait, get back here. And she came running back. She said, what? I gotta go. I said, why are you having a sit-in? And she said, I don't know, I gotta go. Paula, that's not okay. Now, here's the funny part. They did have the little sit-in, and the administration was just beside them. So, again, very conservative principal and vice principal. And so I was late to work twice in my life. And one day my alarm did not go off. I woke up, it was like 15 minutes before I was supposed to be at school. I lived way across town from school. Jumped into clothes, got there just in time for this meeting at which the principal was saying, he looked at me coming through the door and he said, let me say that again. And there were some on the staff who knew this was going to happen. And I slunk into a seat. Well, what I didn't know, that's all I knew ahead of time. But what I didn't know ahead of time, there was one teacher who had had kids in his office during lunch hour. And they would talk about these things they cared about, things that maybe they couldn't talk about in a classroom. And then that's where I guess that planning happened. But I was certainly a victim of it. Am I done? Oh, okay. One final comment. I would say my part was extremely small and limited here during the Vietnam War. I was in a very, very difficult emotional place myself. But everything that happened from the First World War to Mississippi, to the Vietnam War, and what happened here specifically in Eugene, led me on to the sanctuary movement, to Presbyterian Church eventually, even though I wasn't going to go to church for about 20 years, too heavy, and South Africa, and now involvement with a Native American tribe. It changes you forever. Once you know the truth, you can't unknow it. Thank you.
Can we, quiet, please? Thank you.
My name is Glenn Gordon, and I probably am the oldest person here. I just turned 90 this last month. So anybody older than that?
Well,
I'm usually the oldest person in the group. So, and the other thing is that Sue and I came with our family, 5 children at that time. Later we had 2 more, so we had 7 children in all. 5 daughters, 2 sons. We came in 1955, so we were here early on. And we've seen Eugene grow, of course, from 37,000 to 150,000 or so now. I'm a latecomer, and I really didn't become active against the Vietnam War until 1970. And if you had a child in college on that day in spring of 1970, when Nixon started bombing Cambodia, you probably received the same phone call that we did at home. Our daughter Sharon, who was at Stanford at the time, joined along with most all colleges around the country, all the students calling their parents and saying, what are you going to do about this war in Vietnam? That's 1970. Well, I hadn't been active against the war, but I must tell you that my mother and father were pastors in Methodist Church in Texas, where I grew up. And my father was a very moderate, progressive person, even though we were in the South. And I was blessed because in the environment that I grew up in, I learned the values of religion. And I have been in religion all of my life, up until recently. Things have changed a bit later, but I was in the Methodist Church until 1970. And when a new minister came to the Methodist Church here after having been in 15 years, Sue and I decided, since he chose to follow the pro-government concept of continuing the war in Vietnam, we had to go to another church where there was a difference. And we went to help Norm Pott go to Central Presbyterian Church because he was the one of the main ministers in the town at that time who was speaking out against the war. Leslie. I do remember, Ron Kikas, how much I appreciated your stand in the 1968 time. That was wonderful, and I was very proud of you for doing that. But the call from Sharon was the thing that got Sue and I started, no doubt about it. We had been vacillating. I had been very busy in my life up until that time. In 1968, I was president of the Oregon Medical Association, and I had been very busy in organized medicine all those years. But in 1970, we could see that the United States was headed the wrong way. We were doing things that were absolutely terrible. I became active. Marion Malcolm helped me get started, OK, against. We helped reactivate TALC, and I appreciate what Steve Deutsch did in getting it started initially. But we became a more active organization again. Norm Pott became the first president after we reactivated. And we have been going for 50 years since that time. It's wonderful. I'm very pleased with what that's done. I think the thing that I did that I appreciate the most was in 1971. I went to Vietnam. At least the war was still on. Didn't end until 1975. But in 1971, I got to go to Vietnam and work in Da Nang, in South Vietnam, as a doctor in the provincial hospital as a surgeon. There were only 7 interns in that big hospital, provincial hospital, and they had massive amounts of trauma, amounts of injuries, amounts of people who were sick. They couldn't be taken care of because there were not enough doctors there. I did as much as I could to help, but I got to see Vietnam at the time of the war. I took over 1,500 Kodachrome pictures. I came back from Vietnam. I spoke at place after place after place, trying to help the public educate what was happening. And I agree with what Ron said too, that I believe it was the church's involvement, the fact that the communities became understandable about what was happening, that finally turned the government against the war and finally stopped in 1975. I want to recount one thing that happened while I was in Da Nang. I had an appointment with the director of the hospital at the 95th Troop Hospital across the bay in Da Nang one afternoon. We were making a tour, and during the middle of that, a siren came on, and the doctor immediately went to the emergency area. I went with him. Helicopters, Huey helicopters, were bringing in body bags right at that time from the front over in Cambodia of American troops that were killed that very afternoon, brought them back to Da Nang in body bags. That was a very impressive event that I personally had experience with. I mean, there's no question that the war was bad, but it took a long time for the public to recognize it and get it stopped. Excuse me, I just had my knee operated 2 months ago.
Wow.
Knee replacements. I think it's going to be okay.
Do you want to say? Dan?
Yeah. I'm Dan Goldrich. I taught politics at U of O for a long time. I retired. I was a very political kid, and so by teenage I knew what was going on in Vietnam. And I knew about the Geneva Accords, which the U.S. broke. I'm not going to say what I was going to say. First, I'm totally in awe of you.
this group of people is marvelous. What you've said is beautiful. Your experience is so rich and so full of courage that I'm virtually speechless, but I'm going to repair to something that occurred to me last night. In 1970, I read an article which became his book, an article by the psychiatrist Robert Lifton called Home from the War. And it changed the course of my life. And I realized last night that was sort of the theme of this and of what my life became. His point about, in Home from the War, he reports on working with Vietnam vets who came home needing some kind of therapy that didn't exist. And Lifton and a few associates and they created the institution of rap groups. And they dealt with their guilt. It's a beautiful book. The most important I ever read. And in it, he talks about, this is, I think, the message. If you experience evil, and if you participated in it, well, if you know about evil, and you don't act, you're going to be guilty, and you're going to feel it somehow. And there's stagnating guilt that can ruin your life, and some awful things that have happened to lots of vets. And there's animating guilt. And I know guilt had a bad name in the 70s, but I treasure it. Because what Lifton's discovered in his work is that if you can confront it, if you can bring yourself to life around that, then you can make a difference. You will make a difference first to yourself, and you may make a difference to the community. It's a beautiful book. And I think I was a very conventional social science teacher. I was liberal, progressive, but I think I was very conventional. But I had a lot of Latin American experience, which I didn't know how to use for a long time. I knew the score about empire and all that, but I didn't know how to use it. And I think my work with so many others on Vietnam changed me as a person lucky enough to be a professor. And it made me drop the horrible kind of social science work I'd done up to that point. And with a lot of help from students, from whom I learned so much, I learned environment from the students. Then I taught it for the rest of my career. But I learned it from great students. And I figured out slowly and over time how to commit to really promising social movements. And so at first, that was community-controlled economic development. In the 60s and 70s, it was happening. People were experimenting with creating new institutions, community development corporations, and so on. And I worked with people in Eugene, and then particularly in the Whitaker neighborhood, to do that, to take democratic control at the community level, to work for it. And I began to feel tremendous pleasure and gratitude in being able to work with students about these efforts and to look into it and try to retain a certain critical mind, but to commit to it as a participant and observer. And my teaching and community life became rich. I've been so lucky. And from then on to, I don't have much time. Oh, God. I'll just say the Central American movement. And I had a lot of experience in Latin America, but with Central America, I went there. And some of you went before me, and I watched you very carefully. From Sanctuary to the Central American movement, and then I went to El Salvador with Bill, probably the best experience of my life. A hard experience in that year, in those years. And then I went to Nicaragua as Witness for Peace, and then another time. And it just, I drew from the animation of Central Americans, of their confrontation with their circumstances and their...
I want to thank Marion for the terrific vision to put this afternoon together.
Yeah.
And,
Yes, thank you.
and the honor that you give all of us.
But you get the credit, because you organized that event last spring about Vietnam, and the first person who asked a question was somebody who said he was a vet and had been received in a hostile way, and I had no argument with him. If that was his experience, that was his experience. But then the conversation kind of lumps the peace movement into being anti-vet.
Yeah.
And that wasn't okay with me, so I was taking a writing class, and I wrote my own story, and then at the end of that I thought, that's just my story. Every single one of us that was against the war had our own story, and we came to it from different places and for different reasons, and we came together and did things.
People that I met gave me this very different notion of someone who was a lot older than me and how bright and thinking and creative they could be. An eye-opener. You know, the age that all of us, a lot of us read now, it's sort of, it's like, you know, she was that time. It seemed old to me. I actually found a thread here that I find rather fascinating. In addition to being white and gray, it seemed like most everybody has this academic connection, which I sort of saw as a negative for a moment, kind of like, you know, anytime there was considered like we don't have people of color, we have too many men. It's like, where are the working class folks? They're all academics and stuff. But it also reminds me, you know, of the time of Vietnam and how much people in academia didn't have to be the way everybody in this room was. So many just could have stayed in that ivory tower and closed their minds and hearts to what was going on, and so many did. And it took fighting against that. I should just mention that while all of you were doing things here in Eugene, I was doing my stuff in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it was a very different kind of experience because I didn't have the kind of allies that we have in this room. It was a lot of going it alone sort of thing. So Carol said that your kids made it personal. Your son saying, you know, what is this going to happen to me? And a lot of people said that vets changed things. That's something I always felt too. When the vets came back and were anti-war, it changed things. And it occurred to me that that's the thing. For the vets, it was personal. It was so personal. They were there. And when they turned, when their concept of the war, because a lot came back still pro-war. It wasn't just being over there.
And a lot of them became anti-war because they came into this academic setting and, GI Bill stuff put them on campuses. And so a lot of the work that people were doing and questioning, did we really do any good? Did we make a difference? I think everybody made a difference. The Vietnamese made the difference, but Americans made a difference. And one of it was connecting to the vets and getting them to change. And of course the war experience, but that had to get, that had to be brought together. The intellectual concepts, the facts, the figures, the information had to connect with their war experience for them to become anti-war. So that was a really important thing that happened, and I think people here have a lot to do with that. So the provocative thing is, I think everybody here, I got the impression, somebody said it from the very beginning, but one thing is we were opposed to violence, that violence was a bad thing. And what I want to toss out is that the way everybody feels? Was violence entirely a negative? Think, for instance, how much Malcolm X legitimized Martin Luther King for Middle America. It put him in a role that he wasn't the boogeyman because Malcolm X got to be that. And so how much did the violence make the peace movement what it was, gave it this legitimacy and this strength? And without it, would it have been there? I'm not saying I'm advocating that, I'm tossing it out as a devil's advocate to see how people think about that.
I'm in a very funny, curious position on that, because as Ellen will remember, in Chapel Hill, in the civil rights and peace movements, I was not intellectually a pacifist, quite not so. I could see a role for revolutionary violence, not then, but at some future point. We were surrounded by pacifists, including Ellen. On the other hand, thinking about times here in the 60s and 70s, when I actually would see some leftist students walking around in a crowd on the EMU terrace holding pistols, or wearing cartridge belts, sometimes with and sometimes without cartridges. No, I don't think that those were among the constructive elements among us. As I was mentioning in the break, there was one term when on my roster in one class, I had 2 students who were under indictment for entirely unrelated acts of political dynamite. Richard Oba and Roy Bennett were both on my roster, not frequently in class, but both on my roster, and I had very friendly out-of-class relations with both of them.
When you showed up.
Well, I would see them, I'd see them at the EMU and other places, if not in class. I have no trouble understanding how many people felt a positive role for I would not say revolutionary, just blam violence in the situation. Children are being napalmed. You ought to be doing something. Shouldn't you be doing something on the same scale as napalming? And then what is that if not some kind of violence? I could understand that, but I do not think that in fact it played a very constructive role.
I'm not sure which violence you're talking about.
And also the definition of violence is important.
Yeah.
One person's confrontation is another person's argument. One person's act of civil disobedience that happens to involve the destruction of property is another person's getting a focus on something that was just a physical object, as opposed to a person getting hurt or something like that. So that's important to put it in, as Jack said, put it in context. And whenever you get a large group of people that are upset about what, a large group of people, you get a spectrum. You get people like Jack just mentioned. I know both those guys fairly well. They both had their issues, let's put it that way. They both went on to lead more constructive lives in the future. But both of them had to serve a serious amount of time for what they did. And it was an era in which you could get, like I mentioned, my cousin, you could get drafted for taking one less credit hour than you were supposed to. One of my friends, they attempted to draft him because he got a B in a class. He was a pre-med. He was smart enough to get out of that. He just changed his major. And so it was a whole different, world in terms of what could happen to you fairly easily. On the front lines of Chicago, my group didn't get beat up because we kept moving. The people who got beat up were the peaceful people, the people who thought they had rights. And for example, the Bad Shell incident, which made a lot of television footage, it started with somebody pulling a flag to half-mast. It ended with the cops coming in a flying wedge and attacking the crowd, beating up anybody in front of them. So, obviously there was a lot of violence involved in it, but the least little thing could provoke it. And you never knew what that was going to be. It was so tense.
Ron and then Bill?
Well,
And then
violence was always a difficult thing for the anti-war movement because we were against the violence of the war. But the response that you got from government, from police, often provoked people. The anger against the war often made provocateurs out of some people in the movement. And the argument with them was always a strategic one. I don't think that violence committed by the anti-war movement gave the anti-war movement any credibility. It may have been a way for people who chose to express that because as a reaction to what they saw of oppression, but it always caused problems. It caused problems every time you organized something that was massive as to whether or not someone was going to provoke violence. And sometimes the provocation was not an intended provocation of violence, but at that period of time in Eugene, Oregon, and many other communities, except perhaps the South, which had already seen it in the civil rights movement, the police were not used to being confronted. They were not used to having people in the streets and not willing to leave the streets until they made their point. But to them, get out of the street. If you don't, I've got. And I'm seeing some of this today. The most difficult question I often got asked was an assumption that we were violent and what we thought of the violence. What I always tried to do was turn that back around, that it was not the anti-war movement that was violent. It was the anti-war movement that was trying to stop the violence of the war. There is a difference between, it doesn't justify their actions, but there is a big difference between somebody in a demonstration deciding they're going to throw a brick at a police officer and dropping cluster bombs or dropping thousands of bombs on Vietnam. And that was a distinction that I always tried to make every time I got a question about the violence. It wasn't being associated with it or justifying someone in the anti-war movement's violent actions. It was trying to turn it and recognize the enormity of the violence that was occurring in Vietnam.
square yards of it.
Yes.
Anybody remember that one? You'd have thought a terrible crime had been committed. Oh my goodness, they messed with the astroturf. The point, of course, was we were defoliating in Vietnam an area the size of the state of Massachusetts. And this was a few square yards of artificial grass.
I remember doing a demo, organizing it, being part of, I'm not an organizer, because I think I was out of the university then, but kind of planted the idea of a proper demonstration was to go to some university building and start digging holes in their lawn. And I can't remember, maybe it was ROTC headquarters or something, where demonstration went with some shovels and started digging bomb craters in the lawn of the building.
In Nebraska, we had occupied the Rotc building equivalent, it was called the Military and Naval Science Building, the same day as Kent State. And I suddenly found myself in the position, knowing that 4 people had been killed that morning, with some authority and leadership about what was going to happen next in terms of our moves with the police, and feeling like, you know, I might have some say in whether somebody lives or dies, and it certainly changed my attitude about it, you know, to be very conservative about violence and putting ourselves in a position where somebody could get hurt. The other thing I think...
Deborah, let me just say one minute. So, but there really was a lot of slogans around shut it down, bring the war home. And that came out of having been against that war for a long time, and people being at a great deal of risk from getting sent over there and all of that. And yeah, I don't know whether that shortened the war. You know, who knows? Who knows? But the movement as a whole, including the militant parts of it, made it harder for the government to keep on doing business as usual, and that, I think, was the objective of that.
And I guess I'll just say this and see if there's any more time for more. But my question about the Vietnam vets and their impact, I think they brought the specter, not actual violence, but the specter of violence before the government. In other words, they saw them as really dangerous the same way they saw the Black Panthers as so dangerous in the civil rights movement. That they were trained, they had weapons, that sort of thing.
I never saw the vets against the war pose that kind of threat, though. I mean, in most cases, you know, they were telling us about the experiences of the war and the horrors of the war, and they were not. The Vietnam vets against the war and the ones that were part of the organization and had joined any of the anti-war activities, they were not the ones that I saw as.
I agree with that, Ron, but that's not the point. The point is that the government didn't see it the way you and I see it.
I don't know how the government saw that.
I think we know that.
I think what you said and what many people said is that really helps move the broader public to a different place.
Gave it a lot more credibility.
Right. I'd invite you to...
Is there another question?
I'd invite any of you to respond to each other or ask each other a question.
People have stuff written down on their little card.
Yeah. Bill?
Just, shouldn't talk more than once, but nonetheless, I want to back up what Marion said. Here, basically the American Revolution was like our Vietnam, you know, in that we could not have sustained that war over there with all that it was costing us, plus all of the social dislocation at home, and therefore eventually the other guys had to cave. And the violence or the threat of violence or whatever it may have been was, I think, a pretty essential part of that. Make the country ungovernable or you don't win.
Appy, who was here recently, made the additional point that you couldn't wage a war where you had soldiers who were no longer willing and were actually shooting each other, fragging each other. So that was also required. That made it you couldn't wage the war.
Let's have Dennis and then
There's
along the same kind of argument. I think what was happening is also if the system is going to run over the long term, new generations have to take their place. And at the time, numerous people commented about how that transition wasn't taking place. I mean, people who were really worried. And the other thing that I think was going on that caused so much trouble was like this, the paradigm of the country. You know, like George Lakoff kind of, these deep paradigms was of the family. And one could have these disagreements within the family, but when the family was attacked, and when the family sort of interacted with, you know, the foreign policy was part of the family. And I think that is what that was one of the things that people were deeply bothered by. And really, there was no other way to really avoid that being deeply bothered, because people really weren't conscious of that. I remember in 1963, when in New York, the Progressive Labor Party used the Red Cross network of blood, and they were advertising, give blood to the Viet Cong. That was their, I mean, just how outrageous was that? And, but the fact is that it's damage to that paradigm that is necessary. So I tend to think that maybe the violence overall, I think was rather minimal. I mean, when you, like I said, the Black Panthers were assassinated, okay? And that just doesn't compare to, you know, some of these symbolic blowing things up.
Hey, Jack and Ruth?
Well,
Gary had his hand up.
Okay.
I have doubts about the pertinence of what I was going to say.
Okay.
I just want to ask a different kind of question. Who in the room, because of what you did, how you did it, the stance you took in Vietnam, was then forever after separated from your family? Or maybe it's one family member or whatever. I think maybe Debbie touched on it a bit. I don't know that I said it or how I might have said it, but it certainly was always different after that period of time. I mean, I've never sort of really totally resolved it with my family, but other people?
I didn't have that kind of issue. I had some wonderful parents. My father fought in World War II, was on a Navy ship. Kind of always wanted me to go into the military, but not under those conditions. And he never talked about the war much because he didn't want to appear to be bragging about war. My mother didn't like the war, but you know, she wasn't one of those who was worried about my position. She was always worried about me getting arrested and having an effect on the, you know, my future. But what I did, and because, and in part this because I was fairly visible, kind of put them through hell. I mean, they took the brunt among a number of their circle of friends, their acquaintances, people they worked with. I'm sure because of my public position and the attention that I got, it affected them. But I was fortunate that it was never anything that they threw back on me. I would just hear stories later about the father of, you know, a family friend or one of my best friends telling mom she must have raised a communist, those kinds of things, and I'm sure I put them through. Not only just the personal difficulties of what I was going through myself and whether I was going to go to war or not. The big relief came, I'll tell this short story, when I got called up for the draft. I'd been elected student body president, started the lottery, I got into 135 or something, and I did get drafted. And I went up to the draft board, and I couldn't tell you what I was going to do. I had started to prepare a CO, but I didn't know if I was going to do that. I could go in, I could go to Canada. I didn't know what I was going to do. I went up to the draft board, took the physical, and it turns out that an undescended testicle that I had from birth that I knew about but had forgotten about will keep you out of the Army. They gave you a pink card and said you couldn't get in even if you wanted to. So I didn't even wait for the bus. Another guy and I hitchhiked back to Eugene, As soon as I got to Eugene and I called my parents up and told them, and they were so relieved. But ever since then, I could truthfully tell people I did not have the balls for the Army.
Might not be able to put that one in the half-hour video that goes into the high school.
Oh, I think it has to go.
It counts as, it's awesome.
But was there anybody whose families said, get out of our lives or something like that?
I knew people that happened to.
Yours? The Quakers?
No, not my family. Beth's family were very committed Christians and were very loving to Beth and very supportive, but they just didn't get the pacifism stuff. And it was tense.
We just never brought it up to our families about the war. My parents were called by the Dean of Women at the University of North Carolina when I was arrested. Jack was arrested too. And they called even though I was a graduate student, and by that time 21, they exercised in loco parentis, even though there was no justification. And we were arrested not because it was a civil rights demonstration, not an anti-war demonstration. And my parents found out about my politics then, but it didn't cause a fissure in our relationship. But I always thought it was such a blessing we moved to Oregon, as far away as we could get from our families. And we could do as we pleased without their knowing.
We visited, we had discussions, we knew that we differed on issues.
We differed, but if they had if your parents had had our politics in their face on a regular basis, it would have been explosive. And you know it.
In visits, it came up and we differed.
So Gary, I'm going to go back to you because you had your long time to go, but go ahead.
Yeah, just as we're going around talking, it occurred to me there are a couple of things that didn't get specifically mentioned, I think that were important in the Eugene, as far as influencing and peace movement. One was the epic sales that were organized.
Oh, yes.
That was primarily a women's movement, I think, and it was very important to bring energy toward the topic of peace. And I think the proceeds went to
Eugene Peace Information Center.
Exactly, very good. Thank you. And the other one that was very important, I think, was the Gene McCarthy presidential candidacy. I think a lot of people got involved in activism around that. And it hadn't come up, hadn't been mentioned. I thought this would be added.
First time it's Canadian, if it was. Of course, we're always getting it late.
And then next week he was killed.
It was a little later.
But not much.
No, not much.
Next month, it was definitely the next month.
Yeah, for 2 weeks.
Another missing piece, I think, and Debbie brought it in a little bit when you talked about the music, Debbie, was I think the role of cultural elements in helping people see the humanity of the people in Vietnam. And that's where I'd really like to call out the name of Don Luce, who came here many times and with the Indochina Mobile Education Project. We had atrocity pictures. People might remember when Ramparts magazine had all those atrocity pictures. Those were really hard to look at and powerful, but what Don did was very different, was he showed beautiful pictures of people that you could feel for. And then he brought he had a film strip, because that was the technology, that was called Tell Them We Are People. And that, he said, was the message that the people he knew in Vietnam wanted us to hear. And I learned a whole lot from that, about how that you need the facts and figures, you need the documentation to be credible, but that's never what actually changes people's minds and hearts.
The other thing we haven't mentioned very much, that Debbie did mention a little bit, I think the music of that period was very important for us. And we partied. when we would go out and get on the streets, but we also partied. I mean, we had fun together. It's a very important part of the movement, I think, but especially the music.
I think that was really important. It's one of the things I appreciate about David's comments and presentations, and a little bit about, and when Marion said, you know, you're gonna end up doing this for the rest of your life, you better learn how to enjoy it, and take some time away from it. Because one of the things that held us together, when we were going through that, and where this community that we're talking about, one of the things that's held it together was humor, creativity, together. You know, and I said face to face. I meant it as you know, we weren't communicating social media, anything else. It was you were talking to people face to face. You were getting to know people. You were sharing experiences. And it was a cultural thing.
Or were you at Lenny's Nash Bar?
Lenny's at 3 a.m.
Yeah, Maxie's was the closest. At that time there was a dry zone, and Maxie's was the closest tap room.
That's right.
And
Lenny's came later.
Yeah.
And Richard Oba was convicted of trying to blow up Max's with dynamite.
But that's really important. That's part of why.
Thankfully, he was incompetent.
That's a connection that that sustained you.
Smart.
You know, when I was done being student body president, I was exhausted. I mean it was full time. It's tension and it's kinds of personal issues about what's going to happen to you and what can you do. But the thing that sustained you through all of that, trying to figure things out and all that tension and all those threats, was the camaraderie that you had with everybody else, you know? We were in it together. And I mean, that's really important. I think that really needs to be emphasized. And David's stuff is, David's always got stories about the creative stuff they did to characterize things or to get people's attention. And you had to do that. You had to have some humor, because otherwise it beats you into the ground.
So there were bombs at the ROTC, but there were also the people in the black pajamas and the conical hats who crept across the field to levitate the ROTC building.
They didn't succeed either.
So I think another theme was, and one of the questions that you were asked to think about when you're thinking about telling your story was, you know, what did we learn from it, and how did you move on in your life? And every single person, it seemed like, it had a profound effect on their future. And maybe you thought you were going to, you know, be a sports writer, but you ended up starting a people's utility movement after the war. Ron's been an activist. All of you, you know, just kept on with activism, you know, and that's, you know, when I got my politics too, and I think it's something that we learn from that movement is how, and it's a real blessing from the movement, all the activism that was carried forward.
Well, I think it's the last that led to participatory democracy and citizen activism and all the kind of dynamics that I think touches many of the lives in this room.
Ruth said something that I thought was maybe sums up it all, which is, once you know the truth, you can't unknow it.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think the real victory was the movement. Was it? You can argue whether or not the anti-war movement, you know, succeeded or didn't. But the real victory is in what's sustained during that period of time. Since then, is I think the real victory, and
so many activists.
We may need something like that again. We need it continuously, but it may.
That prompts for me the question of what its impact is on really young people today. And that was one of the questions we would think about. What did all that mean for us? But as an old person, my question is, what does it mean for my grandchildren's generation? And it seems to me it picks up on what Ron just said. I don't think the same kind of horrific value system that we saw in the 1960s in terms of the right of government to declare stuff and the unquestioning of governmental policies, that wouldn't go over today. So I'm encouraged in that sense. I think that young people have a different way of thinking and looking at the world. And I would hope that might be some of the impact of what our lives added up to in the big picture of things.
I think Steve. Oh, go ahead. Oh, sorry. No, you go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to that, and I would urge every single one of you, if you have not done this especially, but if you ever have the opportunity to go into schools or Sunday school classes or scout, I don't care where it is, but to talk to young people now. I guess because of Freedom Summer, and especially these last couple of years because, you know, there was the PBS special and so forth, so people were aware of it. I've had that opportunity. And I think kids are just hungry to hear the simple stories. It doesn't have to be the blow up of this or the blow up of that, but the creativity that we're talking about and what was on the line and what we saw and how it affected us, and that one person could do something and they could even do it better if they joined hands with someone else. Because those kids walking around with that stuff in their ears, and that's one of the things I tell them. I say, you know, take them out of your ears. Look at the person in front of you coming down the sidewalk and greet them and listen for the bird that maybe you're not going to be able to hear that much longer. But they're startled when you say things like that to them, and they love hearing. And you all have a great, great gift. I'm really, really serious about this, you guys. They need you.
I think there's another lesson to impart, and I'll go back to 1985 when I was in the legislature. And it was my first session, and it was a 20-year anniversary, or the 10-year anniversary of the end of the war, the fall of Saigon. And it just happened to have some students from North Eugene High School up in the gallery. And the tradition is, they're from your district, you give a little welcoming. You know, welcome to this, to the Oregon legislature, seeing your democracy and work, But it was my first session. I started to get to know a lot of the other legislators and people I hadn't known, and I was just set to give a little, normal opening, or normal thank you for coming and recognizing them. But then it struck me, this is the 10-year anniversary of the fall of Saigon and the end of the war, and that was a pretty tense time. People were on opposite sides, arguing over the war and casting aspersions on each other's position. But it occurred to me, what I should point out to them was, 10 years later, we are here in this body, and some of the same people that served in Vietnam, or my colleagues, are here with me. Some are friends, some of whom we agree on issues. Now, some don't. But the lesson to me was that 10 years later, some of those differences had subsided. And we were working together, some Republicans, some Democrats, some served in the war, some didn't. We were working together here on another purpose. We weren't arguing the war, but we were working together to try and come up to,
nice point.
legislate the best laws we can for Oregon. So it wasn't a division that continued. Obviously, in politics, there are some divisions that still continue. There's an ebb and flow of majority and everything else. But there was a lesson there to me that I all of a sudden realized it, because some of my best friends, colleagues, and political allies in the legislature were people that actually served in Vietnam or took a different position on the war than I had. But we were there together, serving a different purpose. And I think that's a good lesson to impart to young people, that you can change things, and your enemy, the people that you disagree with now, are not always going to be people that you disagree with later.
I'm just going to do a little time check and say that we need to wrap up. Last comments?
I think the real tragedy for me and for everybody in the room is that this country didn't learn. And we were able to allow a presidential election to be stolen, and the direct result of that stolen election was Iraq. And we are the entire Middle East is paying that price. Our society is paying that price. And eventually, maybe the entire world is paying that price.
Well said. Marion mentioned that I organized these events last year, and my favorite person that came was Chris Hoppy.
Oh, yeah.
And he just wrote this book called American Reckoning. And don't you recommend that book? Yeah.
Absolutely.
You know, and it was about American exceptionalism and when you know the truth, and but then we didn't act on the truth after that. And I just think it's a really sobering account of the what happened since we learned these lessons, so to speak. Okay, last.
Couple of observations. One, some people did learn, because I don't know about the rest of you, but I find myself in an odd position now, thinking that the generals are the ones that understand, and it's the politicians that don't.
Yeah, often.
You know, if George Bush had listened to some of his generals, and that some of the generals I hear now talking have a much different view than the exceptionalists do about foreign policy and what we should be doing. And it strikes me that these are the post-Vietnam military people that I'm just amazed. I find myself agreeing with the military people more than I do some of our political leaders. Another little story about I thought of it when we were talking about the violence. I'm sorry I had a cup of coffee. In 1970, when I was running for student body president, in the middle of the student strike, needed votes from students. There's a whole bunch of freshmen. You know, they've been here a year, but this is kind of overwhelming for a lot of the freshmen. You're just in the dorm, and all this stuff going on. You're just trying to make it through your first year of college, and all this stuff going on, and some of it's really confrontational. And we heard that people were worried about violence. The freshmen hadn't got into the militancy yet. And so during the election, one of David and my friends and campaign decided he put a leaflet out to the dorms, and it had a little drawing of a little hill, and a little cow on it, and some flowers all over. And it said, Ecus likes flowers and cows and stuff.
Scott Barlow.
That was a reflection of we were more than just anti-war, that we liked flowers and cows and people.
The famous Doonesbury line, even revolutionaries like chocolate chip cookies.
Hey, as a wrap-up,
as
a wrap-up point into Ruth's comment, I think this has been so remarkable. I would love to see, not just that it goes to the museum, but that this be, some editing version of this get available to schools, for example, or I don't know what else.
Well, that's the idea. That's exactly the idea. So we will try to make that happen. Fill out your sheets if you haven't done it already.
This is what we didn't do.
Oh, what's
This
that?
is in the name of helping us put the 3 hours into something usable with young people in a classroom setting. And also something we're doing next fall, which is we're wanting to take out a 4-page supplement in the Eugene Weekly that'll cost us $3,000 to lift up the voices of veterans and poetry and so forth, and also talk about Calc's then impending 50th anniversary. These things are going to cost money. If you sign your name here, it does not mean you're committing to any specific amount. It just says we can pester you about it when the time comes.
Okay.
And with that, thank you all so much. The videographer, Marion, all of you.
That ever happen again?
And she said she wished she had done it since I was.
That's what they all say, they tell me that, I just keep on now to the day since I had.
It
wasn't easy for her. It was good. She had I don't know how long it was, but she stayed.
American victory, the BC buildup and gone for road.
It was amazing. Thrilled to be a part of it.
Yeah. was rich.
Are you on? So
how do you want to do it?
Well, if you can leave it with me, I can,
And how can I get it back? Give it to my, I don't live here, I live in Portland.
Before we go, I have this
Yeah, sure.
stuff, if I could just stick it in. And then we'll pick it up from you.
Yeah, that would be good. Your name and phone number on it.
It's nice to meet you.
Sure, you're picking that up.
But I think Jenny said she was interested in.
Did I get release forms from everybody?